January 1943. Central Tunisia. The wind moves low across the desert, carrying sand into eyes already burning from cordite and smoke. German infantrymen stand behind shattered olive groves, watching the American lines through binoculars fogged by breath and disbelief. The ground ahead is littered with wrecked half-tracks, burned Sherman tanks, and bodies still half-covered by drifting sand. By every European standard of war, this should be the end of it. Losses this heavy usually mean collapse, withdrawal, silence. But there is no silence. Instead, engines start again, artillery resumes. Fresh American units move forward into ground where entire companies were cut down days earlier. The attacks are clumsy, sometimes costly, but they do not stop. Rifles reappear where rifles were destroyed. Radio traffic increases where command posts were bombed flat. German officers exchange looks. This is not how armies are supposed to behave after punishment like this. One intelligence report will later note it plainly. The Americans did not fight worse after casualties. They fought harder. To understand why that shocked the Axis so deeply and why it would reshape battlefield expectations across two continents, we need to step back to what the world believed about American soldiers before they ever bled in large numbers. When the United States entered the Second World War in December 1941, most of the world already believed it understood what kind of power America represented. Industrial, certainly. Financial, unquestionably. But militarily, especially at the level of the individual soldier, expectations were far less flattering. German, Italian, and Japanese intelligence services had spent years building a consistent picture of the American fighting man. He was viewed as well-equipped but soft, mechanically skilled but psychologically fragile, a product of comfort, not endurance. In Axis assessments, Americans lacked the fatalistic discipline of German troops, the colonial hardening of British veterans, or the ideological ferocity of Soviet formations. They were seen as civilians in uniform, effective when unopposed, but likely to break when losses mounted. These views did not emerge from nowhere. Before 1941, the United States Army was small, underfunded, and largely untested in modern industrial war. In 1939, it ranked 17th in the world in manpower, behind nations like Romania and Portugal. Many of its officers had never commanded troops in combat. Its armored doctrine was still experimental. Its infantry formations were a mixture of draftees and National Guardsmen pulled abruptly from civilian life. Axis observers watched American training films and parades and drew conclusions. Soldiers chewing gum. Officers addressing enlisted men casually. A lack of rigid formality. To European and Japanese militaries built on hierarchy, ritual, and obedience, this informality appeared to signal weakness. German military journals before the war frequently contrasted American material superiority with what they described as psychological unreliability. Japanese officers steeped in the Bushido ethic regarded casualty tolerance as the true measure of martial worth, and by that standard, they believed Americans would falter quickly. Italian commanders, already struggling with morale within their own ranks, nonetheless assumed that high American losses would produce political pressure and retreat. Early American defeats seemed to confirm these assumptions. In the Pacific, the fall of the Philippines in early 1942 was observed closely by Tokyo. Despite stubborn resistance at Bataan and Corregidor, the surrender of tens of thousands of American and Filipino troops was interpreted not as a logistical inevitability, but as proof that Americans could be forced into capitulation when isolated and bloodied. Japanese after-action reports framed the victory as validation. American soldiers, once cut off and starved, would choose survival over annihilation. In Europe and North Africa, German commanders paid particular attention to America's first ground engagements against experienced Axis units. The initial clashes in Tunisia in late 1942 and early 1943 revealed serious American shortcomings. Units were spread too thin. Command coordination was poor. Artillery support was often delayed or misdirected. When German armor struck with speed and precision, American lines bent, and sometimes broke. To Axis eyes, this was the expected pattern. Heavy casualties produced confusion. Confusion produced withdrawal. Withdrawal confirmed the stereotype. But beneath these surface failures, something else was happening, something German and Japanese observers did not yet recognize. American units were not dissolving in the way Axis planners anticipated. They were absorbing losses, rotating personnel, and returning to the fight with adjustments rather than resignation. The Axis interpreted early American defeats through familiar European logic. Armies that lose badly early tend to lose confidence permanently. France in 1940 was the reference point. Once morale cracked, no amount of material could repair it. What Axis commanders failed to account for was that the American military, unlike most armies they had faced, was not built around preserving formations at all costs. It was built around replacing them. Losses in the American system were not signals to stop fighting. They were data. By early 1943, Axis forces still believed they were watching an opponent in the process of learning how to lose, not one learning how to endure. That misjudgment would become painfully clear only after casualties mounted far beyond what any pre-war analysts thought politically or psychologically tolerable. And to understand why those casualties did not produce collapse, we must look more closely at the structure behind the American soldier, the system that allowed punishment to harden rather than shatter. The Axis misread American resilience because they misunderstood the foundation beneath it. They focused on the individual soldier's background, his civilian origins, his lack of ideological conditioning, while overlooking the system that surrounded him. In the American way of war, morale was not sustained primarily by tradition or fatalism. It was sustained by replacement, rotation, and overwhelming support. From the moment the United States mobilized after Pearl Harbor, its military planning assumed casualties on a scale unmatched in American history. War Department projections openly anticipated hundreds of thousands of dead. Unlike European armies shaped by decades of demographic anxiety, the United States planned for loss as a logistical problem rather than a moral crisis. Men were drafted, trained, shipped, and replaced with industrial regularity. This did not make death easier. It made it expected. American infantry divisions were not designed to fight continuously until destroyed. They were designed to be replenished. When a platoon was cut down, its place in the line did not vanish. New men arrived. When an officer was killed, another took his map and radio. The structure endured even when the faces changed. To Axis observers accustomed to preserving veteran formations, this behavior appeared inhuman, as if losses had no weight. But they did have weight. The difference was how that weight was absorbed. American training emphasized initiative more than perfection. Soldiers were taught that mistakes would happen in combat, that survival depended on adaptation rather than flawless execution. This produced early battlefield sloppiness, but it also created a culture in which failure did not automatically destroy confidence. A unit could be mauled and still believe it would fight again, because it always did. Equally important was the role of firepower. American doctrine did not expect infantry to win by courage alone. Artillery, air support, and armor were not supplements, they were central. When casualties mounted, the response was rarely retreat. It was more shells, more aircraft, more fuel. Losses triggered escalation, not withdrawal. German officers in Tunisia began to notice this pattern. After bloody engagements, American attacks did not become smaller. They became heavier. Artillery barrages grew longer. Air strikes appeared earlier. Supply convoys multiplied. What looked like recklessness was in fact systemic pressure. The psychological effect on Axis troops was profound. In European warfare, heavy casualties usually marked the climax of an engagement, the moment when one side will broke. Against the Americans, heavy casualties often marked the beginning of something worse. The battlefield did not quiet, it intensified. In the Pacific, Japanese commanders confronted the same paradox. On Guadalcanal and later islands, American units continued attacking positions that had already. For the American infantrymen, heavy casualties were not abstract statistics. They were names disappearing from morning roll calls, empty foxholes, helmets left behind in the mud. Inexperienced replacements stepped into units already scarred by combat, often meeting veterans who carried grief quietly, without ceremony. This churn of faces created a brutal normalization of loss. Survival depended not on denying death, but on functioning alongside it. The result was not emotional numbness, but a narrowing of focus. Orders mattered. Cover mattered. Staying alive mattered. Fear did not disappear. It became controlled. Axis observers mistook this control for detachment, never realizing it was the product of constant exposure. German and Japanese after-action reports increasingly noted a disturbing inconsistency. American units fought poorly in their first engagements, then returned sharper and more dangerous after suffering losses. This violated Axis experience. Normally, attrition degraded performance. With Americans, it refined it. Reports from North Africa describe U.S. units learning rapidly under fire, correcting eras between engagements rather than collapsing from them. Japanese commanders on Guadalcanal recorded similar observations, noting that American assaults grew more coordinated after repulse, not less. These patterns were difficult to reconcile with pre-war assumptions. American officers faced a unique burden. Casualties did not remove responsibility, they multiplied it. Commanders inherited units they barely knew, often after predecessors were killed or wounded. Leadership became less about inspiration and more about continuity. Maps were passed hand to hand. Radios changed operators. Orders stayed the same. Axis armies prized cohesion built over years. The American system accepted cohesion built in weeks. This flexibility, born of necessity, allowed units to remain operational even when decimated. To enemies expecting paralysis, this was deeply unsettling. American soldiers carried civilian habits into war: humor, informality, improvisation. Axis forces initially read this as weakness. In reality, it allowed emotional release. Jokes after bombardment. Complaints that masked fear. Letters home that anchored identity beyond the battlefield. Casualties hurt, but they did not erase selfhood. Soldiers returned to the line not because of ideology or honor codes, but because the system demanded it and because their comrades were still there. The Axis failed to understand that this civilian grounding could coexist with extraordinary endurance. Each of these angles revealed the same truth from different directions. The more punishment American units absorbed, the less predictable their behavior became. As American casualties rose, so did the density of firepower. This was not accidental. U.S. doctrine increasingly substituted explosives for lives. Artillery became the primary killer, not infantry rifles. Air support was requested aggressively, even for small unit engagements. When attacks failed, the answer was rarely withdrawal. It was preparation: longer barrages, more aircraft, more ammunition. Axis troops noted that American assaults, once bloodied, returned accompanied by overwhelming fire. This pattern eroded the traditional relationship between loss and defeat. Casualties no longer signaled weakness. They signaled escalation. For Axis soldiers, this created a psychological trap. Heavy American losses should have brought relief, evidence that the enemy was being worn down. Instead, they produced dread. Every successful defense was followed by something worse. German veterans in Normandy would later describe the feeling of never finishing a battle in the Pacific. Japanese defenders faced relentless assaults backed by naval guns that could not be answered. American persistence transformed defense into endurance contests the Axis could not sustain indefinitely. Morale did not break in one moment. It drained away. Endurance came at a terrible price. American casualty lists grew long. Entire companies were wiped out. Survivors carried trauma that doctrine never accounted for. The system that allowed replacements also ensured that men were fed continuously into killing zones. Axis observers saw the result but not the internal cost. They assumed indifference where there was sacrifice. What looked like disregard for life was, in fact, a grim acceptance that the war would not be won cleanly. Persistence was not painless. It was chosen because the alternative, defeat, was worse. By this stage of the war, Axis commanders no longer questioned whether Americans would keep coming. The question had shifted to whether anything could make them stop. The answer would be tested in moments where expectation and reality collided with full force, decisive battles where Axis forces waited for collapse and instead watched the Americans surge forward again. Those moments formed the turning points of entire campaigns. February 1943. The Kasserine Pass. German commanders believed they were about to deliver a decisive lesson. American forces in Tunisia had already suffered serious losses. Units were inexperienced. Command structures were fragile, the terrain favored armor. Everything pointed toward collapse. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's forces struck, the initial results seemed to confirm every pre-war assumption. American positions were overrun, tanks burned in narrow defiles. Entire battalions withdrew in disorder. For the Axis, this was the moment casualties were supposed to finish the job. They did not. Within days, American units regrouped. Commanders were replaced. Artillery was centralized. Air support was reorganized. The same formations that had broken under the first blow returned to the line, not cautiously but aggressively. German after-action reports noted the change almost immediately. American defenses stiffened. Counterattacks increased in coordination. Where confusion had ruled, discipline appeared. The shock was not that the Americans recovered. Armies recover. The shock was how quickly they did and how much punishment they were willing to absorb in the process. In the Pacific, a similar realization unfolded months earlier on Guadalcanal. Japanese forces inflicted severe casualties during night assaults and jungle engagements. American units were exhausted, undersupplied, and repeatedly pushed back. By Japanese doctrine, the defenders should have broken. Instead, American Marines held Henderson Field at staggering cost. Each failed Japanese attack produced heavier American resistance. Casualties did not empty the perimeter. They thickened it, the pattern repeated at Tarawa in November 1943. The first assault waves were cut down by interlocking fire. Losses were catastrophic. From the Japanese perspective, no force could sustain that level of attrition and continue. Yet once Axis commanders understood that American casualties did not signal retreat, the battlefield logic they had relied upon began to fail. Defensive calculations collapsed. Timelines stretched. Positions held too long became death traps. The war entered a new phase, one defined not by maneuver, but by endurance under pressure that never eased. In Normandy, this reality set in slowly and brutally. After June 6, 1944, German units expected the heavy losses inflicted during the landings to blunt further attacks. Instead, American divisions pushed inland through the hedgerows with relentless momentum. Casualties mounted daily. Platoons vanished. Yet every gap created by death was filled. The hedgerow country became a grinder, not because of tactical genius, but because Americans kept advancing through spaces already proven lethal. German field reports from July described an enemy that returned immediately after repulse, often with greater artillery preparation and overwhelming air cover. The psychological effect was cumulative. Defensive victories no longer brought relief, they brought exhaustion. Every stand delayed the inevitable but consumed irreplaceable manpower. In the Pacific, the same truth unfolded with even greater clarity. On Saipan and later, Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders planned for American morale to fracture under sustained loss. Instead, the Americans adapted their assaults. Casualties led to methodical destruction. Flamethrowers, demolition teams, and naval gunfire replaced frontal attacks. Where lives had been spent, firepower followed. Iwo Jima marked the final realization. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed, taking an island less than 8 square miles. By any previous standard, the losses should have halted the operation. They did not. Axis observers and surviving Japanese commanders recognized that the Americans would accept casualties that exceeded rational cost-benefit calculations. The objective mattered. The system could sustain it. This was the moment Axis morale truly broke. Not in panic, but in certainty. The belief that Americans could be stopped by punishment alone vanished. German soldiers in late 1944 no longer wrote about breaking the enemy. They wrote about surviving him. Heavy casualties no longer promised victory. They promised escalation. The Axis had misjudged the nature of American endurance. They believed morale was finite. They discovered it was renewable, fed by replacement, firepower, and an unrelenting operational tempo. By the time this lesson was fully learned, the strategic balance had already shifted beyond recovery. The cost of that misunderstanding would define the war's final chapters. The realization that American forces did not weaken after heavy casualties forced the Axis into a series of reactive decisions, most of them too late. Tactical plans built on attrition failed. Defensive doctrines hardened without becoming effective. The immediate aftermath of this misjudgment was not collapse, but erosion, a steady loss of ground, initiative, and confidence. In North Africa, German commanders altered their approach after Kasserine. Direct armored thrusts gave way to defensive withdrawals. The expectation of breaking American formations through shock was abandoned. Instead, Axis units attempted to conserve strength, aware that every engagement favored the side that could replace losses faster. Tunisia fell not because of a single defeat, but because the Axis could no longer trade casualties on equal terms. In Italy, the shift became even more pronounced. German defensive lines were designed to delay rather than destroy. American assaults, though costly, kept coming. Monte Cassino, Anzio, and the Gothic Line consumed thousands of lives on both sides, but the pattern remained consistent. Losses did not stop American pressure. They slowed it temporarily, then intensified it. Axis units rotated into these defensive sectors increasingly demoralized, already expecting to be ground down. In the Pacific, Japanese commanders faced a stark reality. The expectation that American casualty sensitivity would limit assaults proved false. Island defenses became increasingly elaborate, but also increasingly hopeless. Each battle demonstrated that Americans would pay the price required to eliminate resistance completely. The result was not negotiated withdrawal or stalemate, it was annihilation. Numbers reflected this imbalance. American casualty figures were high, but Axis casualty ratios became catastrophic. Japanese garrisons were often destroyed almost entirely. German divisions retreated with skeletal strength. The Axis could still inflict damage, but it no longer altered outcomes. Perhaps most damaging was the psychological shift. Axis soldiers entered engagements no longer believing that inflicting losses would end the fight. They believed it would prolong it. This inversion stripped defensive success of its meaning. The war did not end because Americans stopped dying. It moved toward conclusion because Axis forces ran out of ways to make those deaths matter. But the consequences of this realization extended beyond immediate battles. It reshaped strategy, planning, and the emotional landscape of the war itself. As the war moved into its final phases, Axis leadership fully internalized the implications of their early misjudgment. American forces were no longer assessed as a brittle opponent whose morale could be shattered by bloodshed. They were recognized as a system that converted loss into pressure, a realization that fundamentally altered Axis strategy, but too late to reverse momentum. German planning in late 1944 reflects this shift. Defensive depth replaced counteroffensive ambition. The Ardennes offensive itself, often portrayed as a final gamble, was rooted in a fading hope that inflicting massive American casualties might fracture Allied cohesion. When American units held under extreme losses at Bastogne and along the northern shoulder, that hope finally collapsed. Casualties failed to produce the political or military rupture German leaders had counted on. In the Pacific, Japanese strategic thought underwent a similar, grim evolution. The expectation that heavy American losses would force negotiation persisted into Okinawa. When it failed yet again, the consequences were catastrophic. The understanding that Americans would endure extraordinary casualties to secure victory fed into Japan's fear of invasion and ultimately shaped decisions made far from the battlefield. For Axis soldiers, the psychological burden was crushing. Fighting an enemy who did not stop coming created a sense of inevitability. Diaries and post-war interviews reveal exhaustion more than fear, loss of purpose more than panic. Defensive lines were manned by troops who understood that survival depended on delay, not victory. For American forces, the cost was profound. Casualty lists lengthened. Entire communities were marked by loss. Endurance carried trauma that would not be measured for decades. Victory was achieved not through invulnerability, but through persistence that exacted a human toll unmatched in American history. By 1945, the Axis had not simply been defeated militarily. They had been outlasted psychologically. Their early assumptions about American fragility had shaped decisions that accelerated their own decline. And yet, this story is not one of triumph alone. It is a reminder of what modern industrial war demands and what it consumes. To understand what this endurance ultimately meant, we must step back from the battlefield and reflect on the legacy it left behind. War often measures strength in numbers, weapons, and territory. Yet sometimes the truest measure lies in the human response to suffering. The story of Americans fighting harder after heavy casualties reveals a truth that is both simple and profound. Endurance can defy expectation, and resilience can reshape strategy itself. Across deserts, hedgerows, and coral beaches, the same pattern repeated. Loss did not produce submission. It produced adaptation. Units rebuilt themselves, systems compensated for individual absence, and soldiers continued forward despite exhaustion, grief, and fear. What appeared chaotic to the Axis was, in fact, methodical, a manifestation of industrialized warfare intertwined with human determination. The consequences were enormous. Axis forces recalibrated their tactics too late. Entire campaigns were extended or lost because their calculations assumed a psychological threshold that did not exist. Conversely, the United States gained more than territory. It gained credibility, reputation, and the operational confidence that comes from surviving the worst and returning to fight again. Yet there is a somber side. Every American advance after heavy casualties carried a cost measured in lives, families shattered, and trauma unrecorded in battlefield maps. Victory was not clean. It was hard, bloody, and relentless. The endurance that surprised the enemy also demanded a profound human toll. Ultimately, the lesson is enduring. Warfare is not only about strategy or technology, but about understanding human capacity, and sometimes underestimating it can be catastrophic. The Axis misjudged American soldiers not because they lacked information, but because they underestimated the combination of system, support, and human resolve. That misjudgment helped shape the final chapters of the Second World War, leaving a legacy that reminds us how perseverance, even under unimaginable pressure, can redefine the limits of combat. The battlefield remembered the dead. The living remembered the lesson, and history remembered both.